Shana Tova. So my question for all of us is, what are we doing? What are we doing? Praying. All right, but praying. But what are we doing? We are together celebrating, honoring our tradition as we welcome in 5784. But what is this holiday? Rosh Hashanah, what is this holiday about? This is the holiday for sounding the shofar. How amazing was that? Hearing the shofarot, incredible. Our holy Torah in Bamidbar 29 verse 1 refers to this day as Yom Truah, the day for sounding the shofar. And yet, yesterday, Shabbat, did we hear the sound of the shofar? No, we did not hear the sound of the shofar. So my question is, why is this the case? In the Torah, in the Chumash, it says, this is Yom Truah, the day for sounding the shofar. On Shabbat, we didn't hear the sound of the shofar. Why is this the case? Of course, we know yesterday is Shabbat, but is this explanation sufficient? Is that okay if I say Shabbat, we don't sound the shofar? Is that a sufficient explanation? Maybe. Do you know that according to our tradition, when Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbat, during the time of that our holy temple stood, the shofar was sounded on Shabbat. During the time of the holy temple, the shofar was sounded on Shabbat. You may conclude then that the reason for why we do not sound the shofar yesterday is in the acknowledgement that the temple is no more, and therefore this practice was discontinued on Shabbat. You might say that there's no longer a temple. However, after the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed in 70 CE, our founding rabbi, the rabbi of all rabbis, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, ordained this. He said that on Shabbat, the ram's horn was to be blown in every place that there was a court. Moreover, as recently as the 14th century, Rabbeinu Nisim ben Reuven Gorandai wrote that the ram's horn was blown on Rosh Hashanah when it fell on Shabbat. In the court, it was blown in the court of Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi. So why was there no blowing of the shofar at Beit Shira congregation and synagogues around the world yesterday? One of our Jewish values is study, Talmud Torah. We study to be more informed, to take an active role in our Jewish community, to understand why we do what we do, or at least what our sages, ancient and contemporary, have contributed to the vast Jewish bookshelf. We know that Rosh Hashanah is a day of memorial blasts, a day of celebration and contemplation. So the Talmud, the Gemara, cites a proof from the school of Shmuel, taught in a Breita that concerns performing prohibited labor. And the sounding of the shofar is included in this teaching. This is the way that Rabbi Abba ben Yosef bar Chama, a head of Babylonian Jewry during the 4th century, explained the law in Rosh Hashanah 29b. When the festival of Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, in the temple they would sound the shofar, but not in the provinces. From where do we derive this? Well, Rabbi said, by Torah law it is permitted to blow the shofar on Shabbat. And it was the rabbis who issued a decree in accordance with Rabbi. For Rabbi said, all are obligated in sounding the shofar, but not all are proficient in sounding the shofar. Well, we have incredibly proficient shofar sounders here. Therefore, the rabbis issued a decree lest a person take a shofar in his hand and go to a person who is more proficient in order to learn how to sound the shofar. Now, what are they going to do if they need to find someone who is proficient and professional in sounding the shofar? What are we afraid that one might do on Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, on a holiday? That they will travel. They will carry the shofar, the 4 cubits, in the public domain on Shabbat, which again we know, not allowed to do. And this is also the reason for the rabbinic prohibition of taking the taking the lulav on Shabbat. And this is the reason, again, rabbinic prohibition on reading the Megillah on Shabbat. From this, we begin to understand that by Torah law, sounding the shofar in Rosh Hashanah when it falls on Shabbat is permitted. It is rabbinic law that has deemed this act prohibited. Why? Why did the rabbis say Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, no sounding the shofar? Because our sages were concerned that despite the sounding of the shofar not directly violating the laws of Shabbat, the mitzvah to hear the shofar is so important and beloved that it may lead an individual or community to violate the law of Shabbat in order to facilitate the sounding of the shofar. For example, a person who does not know how to blow the shofar may go to a person who does in order to learn how to blow it. And that person will end up carrying the shofar in the public domain, something again that is forbidden on Shabbat. Removing the shofar service when the festival coincided with Shabbat eliminated the possibility of such an eventuality. I know, how amazing was that service? We appreciated that. We're here for Rosh Hashanah for that purpose. This explanation may resonate in different Jewish movements or communities, but how do we at Beit Shira congregation, as a member synagogue of the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, understand our practice of not sounding the shofar on Shabbat? We understand that our practices are grounded in Jewish law, but are adapted to our modern lives and societies. As Rabbis Eli Kaplan Spitz and Elliot Dorff write, the shofar should not be used when Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah coincide. We maintain the Shavua, the prohibition for shofar on Shabbat, due to the opportunity to blast the shofar the following day, which is today. The way this restraint conveys the sanctity of Shabbat and the symbolic character of shofar blowing in contrast to the use of other instruments. There is something intrinsically sacred about the shofar. The mitzvah is lishmoa, to hear the shofar. One must hear the original sound to fulfill the obligation. For this reason, many poskim, arbiters of religious law, conclude that a mechanically or electronically transmitted version would not suffice. There's also something powerful about being in the presence of a shofar as it is sounded. When we do sound the shofar, there is an order, a seder to the shofar service. There is skill required, knowledge, and intention on the part of the individual or individuals, the Ba'alei Tokea, honored with the responsibility of sounding the shofar for the community. We've all heard the often quoted rationale for our physiology. For a while we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. We know listening is an important, active life skill. Listening requires our full participation. Many years ago, I was blessed to spend the summer learning at the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem. Rivka, my cousin, and her husband, Yerachmiel, were living in Sanhedria at the time. Have you been to Sanhedria? Do you know where it is? No. In kind of the northern area of the city of Yerushalayim, still walking distance to the old city, but it's a predominantly Haredi neighborhood. I had recently arrived in Israel. It was June of 2011, and I was staying with 3 of my friends from the army. All 3 of them were completing their degrees at Hebrew University. My friends generously offered the couch in their tiny 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment. As a fellow struggling student, I accepted the offer immediately. I was grateful and did my best to pay back their kindness with cleaning and food prep. They taught me how to make incredible hummus that I'm still trying to perfect, but it's getting better. The apartment was more of a crash pad than anything else, and for that purpose, it was sufficient. It was also great being able to reconnect with my army brothers. But again, the last time that I'd seen Rivka was at my wedding. It was a few years before, 2009. I called her and let her know I was looking forward to seeing her and Yerachmiel during my time in Israel. Rivka was due with their first child, her due date quickly approaching. But without hesitation, she invited me to stay with them for my first Shabbos in Eretz HaKodesh, saying they would be honored to host me for the first Shabbat of my stay. I completed my week of study, and Friday, Erev Shabbos, arrived. On my way to Rivka's apartment, I stopped by a store to buy Yayin Mevushal, a nice bottle of special wine for this community, flowers, dessert. Rivka and Yerachmiel, again, are ultra-Orthodox Hasidim. So I knew I would be in for a traditional Shabbos experience. I arrived at the door. I saw the sign indicating that I was at the right place, the right apartment for Mishpachat Weiss. And I proceeded to knock. A person I had never met before answered the door. It turned out I was not at the right home. The stranger who greeted me chuckled and offered to guide me to the other Weiss family in the same building. Apparently, this mix-up was common. For some reason, in Jerusalem especially, apartments are not always easy to locate. We went down some stairs, through a corridor that led to the back of the building, around a corner, and finally up a staircase that led us to the Mishpachat Weiss I was looking for. I knocked on the door, relieved to finally be face to face with Rivka and Yerachmiel. I thanked the neighbor and presented all of my Shabbat offerings to Rivka. She promptly put me to work. Rivka told me that we would be having an additional Shabbos guest joining us for dinner. I received the tour of this cozy apartment, which it maybe took half a minute, maybe a full minute. It was their first home together, and while it was a no-frills apartment, they made it feel comfortable and inviting. The kitchen was so small, it didn't even have the space to accommodate an oven. Rivka magically prepared a gourmet meal in a kitchen the size of a small closet, using a hot plate and arranging the use of a friend's oven down the hall. That's a miracle. That was a miracle. Yerachmiel then indicated we would be leaving for services soon. But before we left, he prepared to take out one of his most precious wedding gifts. He explained he only takes it out on Shabbos and Yom Tovim. He proceeded to cautiously open the bottom cabinet of his bookshelf. And with extreme care, he pulled out a large leather box. He placed the box on the table, he opened it up, and he greeted his shtreimel with Good Shabbos. He thoughtfully placed the shtreimel on his head, and closing his eyes, he said again with a full voice of gusto, Good Shabbos. This time directed not at the shtreimel, but to all of Jerusalem. We made our way to the little shtibel he davened at. It was one of the smallest shuls that I've ever been to, and I have been to some small shuls. Standing room only, and I mean standing room only. When we arrived, everyone was kibitzing and greeting one another. But then in an instant, everyone grew silent. The Rabbi had arrived. I was standing in this overwhelming silence of respect as the Rebbe made a beeline for me. He wore a bekasha, a black frock coat, and a shtreimel, and when we were face to face, he extended his hand. He says to me, Shalom Aleichem, Good Shabbos. He exclaimed, this Shabbos you daven by us. I felt very welcomed. As the davening began, I closed my eyes. It's been over 12 years, and I still vividly recall this strong Kedusha experience. I felt like I was floating. in this group in which we were all intently and fervently connecting with the tefillah. The collective joy in the arrival of Shabbat was infectious. The feeling of Shabbat was all around us, and it was within us. We felt what felt like only moments later. Someone put his hand on my shoulder. I opened my eyes, and to my surprise, it was the Rabbi. He said again, "Good Shabbos." He then confirmed that I would be eating by my cousin, making sure I had meal arrangements for all of Shabbat. The davening had somehow ended, even though it felt like it had only begun. Yerachmiel came over and directed me to the door. Outside, 2 other young men were waiting for us, the other Shabbos guests. When we arrived back at the apartment, a wife of one of the guests and Rivka were finishing up their davening, their praying. We had an incredible meal. Normally I could tell you exactly what I ate when I had a good meal, but I don't even remember. I don't even know what I ate. I just remember the Zmirot, the Shabbat songs, that Shabbat feeling. There was no forced conversation. The night just flowed. We all had an awareness that we had entered sacred time, celebrating the gift and blessings of this holiday. So, why am I sharing this story? Why am I sharing the story? Clearly, my cousin and her family have a drastically different Jewish practice than my family has. I do not long to incorporate their understanding of Judaism into my life and to teach it to my children. But the love and emotional connection to Judaism, that Charyn and I, we do want to raise our girls with. This connection, this love with your families, your community. That's what we want. So what are we doing here at Beit Shira? What are we doing today and for all subsequent days of 5784 and beyond? Why is it so important that when we hear the shofar, we hear the original sound, the Yom Truah? Yom Truah reminds us of the importance of active listening. Today we read the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, the origin. What happened when Hashem said, "You're so faithful, thank you," but no thank you? What was there in the bushes making noise? That God said, this will be the sacrifice, the lamb. The shofar, it is a reminder of faith and mercy. The sounds of the shofar are much more than notes we hear. These are the notes that penetrate our very souls. The shofar is ultimately a symbol of faith. Yom Truah encompasses so much. But at the core, these days are about being present in mind, body, heart, and soul. The Kedusha I felt in this shtibel in Sanhedria that I feel every night Charyn and I bless our girls. This is something I hope we experience in here, that we felt yesterday, that we felt Friday night, Erev Shabbos, Erev Yontif, yesterday, day 1, today, Rosh Hashanah. We feel this, but it does not just happen. It requires commitment to learning and growing Jewishly, to respecting and honoring our traditions. It requires us to make personal connections and to discover what being Jewish means on an individual level. To establish an overall atmosphere of Kedusha requires each of us to do our part cultivating Kedusha. May we all be inscribed and sealed in the book of life. It is my wish, my blessings, that in 5784 that we become closer as a family, closer as a congregation, as a keilah, and closer to Hashem as individuals. That we experience fulfillment as Jews and in doing Judaism together. I want to wish us all the Shana Tova Tikatevu V'Tichatemu. May we all be signed and sealed in the book of life. A good Yontif to us all. Shana Tova U'Mituka. At this time, I just want to bless us all with a life of, inscribe us in the book of life O God, and grant us in the new year a life of peace and goodness, a life of blessing, sustenance, and health, a life marked by true piety and the avoidance of sin, a life free from all shame and reproach, a life of abundance and honor, a life ennobled by love of Torah and reverence for you, a life in which all the worthy desires of our hearts will be fulfilled. This is such an incredible place, such special people to get involved, to get engaged. Everyone here is a blessing. That we should all be blessed to have a healthy, a sweet new year. We conclude our service, page 348. We conclude our service, page 348. Adon Olam.